There's like a whole brain behind it. I mean, I say brain. If I was giving you the marketing pitch, I'd say we have an AI director, right? And maybe that's kind of part of the ethos of Immortality is to trick people, not trick them, encourage people to become as obsessive about watching a movie as I might be. When you think about the point of stories, I think a lot of times we tell stories to bring people into our perspective, right? And to try and concentrate on communicating something.
Silence on Joue is a weekly French podcast from the daily newspaper Libération that talks about video games. We had the chance to talk with Sam Barlow about his latest game, Immortality, in his more general vision of video games and storytelling. We've posted a dub version of this episode, but for the English-speaking public we are also posting a more raw version where you can enjoy our catastrophic English accent. But the important thing is to be understood, right? I leave you with Sam Barlow. Silence on Joue, Erwan Cario, bonjour.
How does that translate, silence on Joue?
Uh-huh.
Hush, we are playing. Shush, we are playing.
That makes sense. Okay.
It's a variation of the silence on tourne action.
Yes.
Before saying action, you ask for silence in order to shoot.
Yes.
That was something that's very interesting when we started localizing Immortality. Was I just assumed that the way in which you like clap a scene in a movie is the same around the world, but it's very different. I think the French prefer numbers over letters, and there was a whole interesting discussion.
Before going into the details of this game about cinema, can you tell us by what miracle you are still working on, still making video games? We suppose, but maybe we're wrong, that Hollywood approached you to transpose your storytelling skills?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked the question of like, and it's sometimes an insult, right? Is when people say so-and-so a game director should be making movies, not games. But I think when people ask it to me, it's genuine. I get asked, why are you not making a movie? And yeah, there have been offers. There were, especially like when Her Story first came out. It was at a time when the movie studios were really starting to get interested in video games generally, because they were predicting they would run out of comic books. So they were deciding that video games would be the next big thing. And so I did the rounds of every studio and kind of production company, talking to them about Her Story, which was kind of interesting. And everybody there was living in absolute terror of video games, because they saw that the younger population was playing too many video games, doing too much social media, and not watching the television, right, that their parents would, or going to the movies. So they knew that they had to do something, but they had no idea, right? They didn't know what games were or anything. But yeah, there were some like very pure offers of, hey, I really enjoyed your games. Clearly, you have an understanding of how these things work. Why don't you come and make a movie for me? And I think, like on an honest level, like I've always made video gamey things. Even if I think back to being a young teenager writing terrible teenage writing, I was doing that on my computer as a text adventure as much as I was, just writing prose. And although I was doing paintings, I was also doing pixel art on my computer and stuff. So it's always just been like a part of the process to think about kind of interactivity in games. So, it feels exciting to be working in this space, and the things that we get to do that feel new and exciting, those are the things that kind of get me out of bed. That said, I do love movies. I have lots of opinions about movies and stories. So this always sounds extremely naive, but like when we finish doing these shoots, where we've got, a crew and a cast that are used to shooting movies or indie movies, and we've made them do things in a very strange way, which everyone enjoys, but it's very hard work. At the end of it, everyone turns around and they're like, next time, Sam, let's just make a movie. It'll be so easy. There's part of me that's like, oh my God, it's such a struggle to, just, creatively, technically try out new things, commercially even. So there's something attractive about just going and making just a movie, just a linear movie that sounds kind of relaxing and easy. But at the same time, it's, there are so many movies. There's so much TV. That's like the thing that keeps anyone making any kind of entertainment awake at night is just how do you get attention? There's just so much going on. And so, a practical part of me is like, well, innovating in this place, I'm kind of on the cutting edge, making new things, and I'm in a small pond, therefore, getting to be a big player in a small pond. Versus if I turned around and made a movie, I'm now competing with everybody else that's making movies. On a practical level, it kind of feels nice to keep doing video games. But I think, honestly, the thing that gets me excited at the start of a project is usually something mechanical or structural, thinking about like, what is the play experience going to be? How is that going to feel kind of interesting? And after that, all the story stuff and everything else kind of follows. But, so I think it's more a case of like, what would have to happen to make me not want to make video games? And, the world tries, the video game world is a tricky place, but so far, so good.
What was your pitch for Immortality? How did you describe the project when you had to convince people to join you?
I think the kind of high level way we were talking about it is probably the same way we kind of pitch it to players was with this the idea that there was this actress who stars in 3 movies and she's disappeared. The movies have been lost and we've now discovered them. And we're kind of getting to explore them and put together the pieces. I think it was probably that simple. And then if it was more of a kind of games pitch, we would usually then dig into the idea of this kind of match cut mechanic, how that was going to be fun. The idea that this would be, Telling Lies was on consoles, and a lot of people also, would plug their Steam Decks or whatever into their TVs so that they could play her story with their partner on a sofa or something. But this was also kind of felt like a moment to say, oh, this is something that like 100% will work on a television, will work on a controller, hence like the visual navigation and stuff. So that was, it was this idea that we were moving into this more visual dimension. And then, and, I think immediately once you were talking to people and you could show mood boards and talk about these different eras and the textures of movies and how exciting it was going to be able to jump around in these different stories. I think that kind of got people's attention.
I'm curious about this idea of the importance of this visual aspect of Immortality. But before, I was curious to hear you about the concept of nonlinear narrative. Where does it come from? Did you have a seminal experience that gave you the idea for this narrative puzzle format?
So, growing up, I was really into art, experimental literature. So, I was a huge fan of the Surrealists. And then, following that kind of train of thought into like the beat writers. So, William Burroughs with his cut up stuff, which I discovered through David Bowie. David Bowie rave about William Burroughs. And then, I could point to some writers like some of the J.G. Ballard's earlier stuff, particularly his novel, The Atrocity Exhibition. But, so I was definitely at a young age reading attempts by people in the written word to mess around with structure. And then, then when I really got into cinema, some of my favorite directors had this same obsession. So someone like Nick Rogue, was particularly famous for explicitly cutting in a nonlinear way. But really, I think like where her story came from, and kind of naively, and then I've sort of subsequently realized this is what was going on. There was really a attempt to take how I write a story and pull the player into that. So, if you write a linear story and deliver it to someone, they get the thing laid out. Even if you're doing Nick Rogue stuff, right? Even if it's Pulp Fiction, there's still a linear piece that you've created. But in the writing of it, it's extremely nonlinear, right? If I'm writing a script, I'm going to have my outline, move scenes around, figure things out. When I'm writing the dialogue, I might write this one scene, think, oh, I want to make a callback, and then I'm jumping back to an earlier scene to see how that was set up. And when you're writing, it's very sculptural. And then, that extends to, I think, all storytelling. So even, something like movie making, you might have a linear script. You might shoot that linear script. But then when you get into the editing room, now you're moving things around. And again, you have this same playfulness and this sense of being surrounded by the material, which I think is kind of what I really started to dig into with her story, was the idea that as a writer, yes, you have this ability to jump around in a story and this kind of flexible perspective, but it's this sense of it being all around you that was exciting to me. And so I think that's kind of my approach to the nonlinear narrative, is the idea of I always make this comparison. I think it's a good one, kind of cheap, but like if you think of a more open 3D video game, right? So you take a brilliant one like Zelda Breath of the Wild. They put you in a 3D space and tell you can walk in any direction, and you discover things, and your curiosity leads you into different corners. Or if it's more rigid like a Metroid, then it feels like you can go anywhere, and you kind of can, but you're going to be kind of backtracking a lot. And in some cases, they know, they're leading you in certain ways. But what I started to really get interested in with her story and the rest of the games was, that exploration and discovery is inherently an extremely key part of a lot of my favorite video games. And what narrative games usually do is still give you that exploration of 3D space, but the story will be doled out, in a more controlled manner, and usually in a kind of linear sequence. So I got excited with her story about this idea that why don't we throw out the three-dimensional space and give you a game where you have that same freedom and kind of desire to explore that you would have in space, but in the narrative. And, you can, in some cases it can be more freeform, but in some cases you are following trails. You're seeing things in the way that you might see a distant castle in Zelda. You might see a thread in the story or see some suggestion that you then kind of follow through. So I think that, has been key to all the games I've been making, is to really not think of them as being any different to a traditional video game. And, my touchstones frequently Nintendo games in terms of game feel and controls and how much freedom you give the player, how expressive or playful the mechanics should be for the player. So, I'm not thinking of them as taking a story and adding interactivity or as a different thing, which is an interactive narrative. I'm thinking of them as playful video games. So, and I think key to them has been, and key to the nonlinearity as well, I think, is figuring out ways to make this feel expressive and playful. Because, on the opposite end, you can play a game like Call of Duty, and we think of that as being a very video game. And in Call of Duty, at least especially the kind of traditional ones, you're pretty much walking down a corridor that's very pretty, and whoever's playing the game, you're going to shoot the same people, and the game is helping auto aim and is tweaking things to make it easy for you to shoot people or whatever. But you could change who's playing the game at any given point, and it would pretty much play out the same. And that always, to me, felt kind of disappointing. Whereas I think if you look at like a Mario game in a very different way, because they allow for playfulness and expressivity, different people can play those games. And it's a narrow mechanic. It's jumping and running. But you have so much freedom to be playful and express yourself through how you run and jump in a Mario game that you get quite kind of fun experiences. And so, with Her Story, on surface, it seems quite simple, but we're giving you the ability to type in any English word, to listen to this woman speaking and pick up and react to things that you think are important, or even guess and predict things. And so that's quite expressive, right? You can kind of have lots of different playful things with the English language. And similarly here with Immortality, the ability to stop the footage at any point and decide something is cool to click on. But as well, like there's this kind of Pokemon Snap headshot thing of like, oh, if I'm going to click on this person as a way of cutting out of this scene, maybe I'll just kind of frame back a few frames to get the really pretty shot of their head, right? So there's like a little bit of kind of expression and kind of aesthetic choice there. So I think it's giving people that ability to express and be playful that I think makes it more meaningful. And additionally, there's no real punishment in these games, which I think is another really helpful thing. I think if you have a game that's very strange or has a confusing control scheme or is just very different to what you're used to playing, and the game is punishing, it's very easy to then lose interest or not put in the effort to kind of discover how this thing works. But I think that the key element with the games I've been making is to try and be generous and respectful of the player's time. So we're not cheating you, we're not really hiding anything from you. We're being very kind of forthcoming in letting you access the content. There's no kind of wrong way to play. You can't really screw up. You will ultimately kind of make progress, right? Just by being interested. So I think that's kind of a key part of it as well.
And do you think that the fact that of being generous and kind to the player to push this expressive things allows you to trust the player?
Yeah, I think the idea of trust was one of the big things that I wanted to do when I became indie and made Her Story, because I'd been working on commercial titles for big publishers, and the reality, especially back then, was that if you were making an expensive commercial title, at the end of the day, this thing would have to be shipped to a video game store, and somebody would be having to pitch it to the regional sales manager. And so, there were a lot of decisions being made by marketing and by executives who were somewhat, easily scared. And I was forever being told that the player is stupid, right? The audience, don't try and be clever, Sam. This is for an audience that is stupid. They used to have a derogatory term, which was Arsenal man, which was the kind of English football fan who might assume to not be that clever, who would be playing your game. And it always kind of pissed me off, because all the evidence pointed against that to me. Was, generally when we put games in front of people, they were always cleverer than the developer. They would always find things you hadn't thought of. And especially what I was seeing was, with the internet, you're no longer limited to your own brain, right? We have these hive minds. So, you look at, a great example of trusting the player would be something like, the From Software games, right? So Elden Ring most recently. When I played Elden Ring and I was trying to uncover a quest line, and I don't like to, because I'm kind of old-fashioned, I don't like to cheat or kind of look online to see what to do. But I got to the point where I was like, okay, I don't have the time. And I looked up how to progress this quest line, and it was so obscure. It was it was the thing that I was like, well, I would never have done that in 1,000 years. But you get, if one person finds this little piece of the quest and another person finds this other little piece, you just, slowly together the community kind of solves these things and finds answers. And similarly, I think You look at like the evolution just of storytelling on television, like the complexity of plot lines and the numbers of characters and the emotional empathy that you're supposed to summon up. And, things are much, much richer and more layered and more complicated than they used to be 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. So for me, this idea that we should think of the games players as not being that smart and have to explain things always seemed wrong. And so really the corrective for me when making her story was to give more over to the player. Is if we're fundamentally an interactive medium, if we're a medium where we're asking the player to do something, the more we ask them to do and the more involving that is, then surely the more interesting the game ends up being. I remember I worked on a first-person shooter where we had an executive play the game on a Friday. And this was a game where you'd shoot monsters and then doors would open up and you'd find keys. And he played it and he said, this is just too confusing and too hard. And we all had to come in. He made us come in over the weekend. And every time a door opened or a key was dropped, we had to program a camera that went from where you were currently, zoom around the level to where the door was or where the key was to show the player exactly where to go next. Spent the whole weekend putting these things in every single time this happened in the game. Although we thought it was ridiculous. It got submitted to the publisher and the president of the publisher turned around and was like, what the heck is this? They're like, do you think that the player is a child? Like, this is pathetic. And we had to remove it all again. But, that's what happens when you have people that don't trust the player. So I think, that is, I think it just naturally leads to richness. And I think it's very evident if you look at the games that people get kind of obsessive about, if you look at the games that people have a really personal connection to, it is the games that ask in some ways more of the player, that give the player more freedom. Those are the games that people kind of connect to.
Let's talk about Immortality more specifically. What was the first idea of Immortality? Where does it come from? Does it come from the subject, the desire to play with cinema as a stage, or is it rather the desire to transpose the hyper-textual narrative design to some kind of hyper-iconic one?
I think, so usually when I have ideas, there's like 3 or 4 things all happening at once. But I think with Immortality, at some point, there was definitely a perverse part of me that had seen people call her story and telling lies interactive movies. And as a fan of cinema, I would always be like, they're not really movies. Like, to me, what defines movies more broadly is that you have the director has control, or the editor. You present images very carefully in a very specific sequence, and that is the cinematic message, right? So the fact that I was making these games that didn't have that control, that didn't have that use of editing, that were in some ways closer to theater, right? Yes, we were still filming actors, but the length of the takes, the way things were written, were kind of very different. So I think there was part of me that was like, okay, if you're going to keep calling these things interactive movies, I'm going to make a real interactive movie. But I think it was, but at the same time, like there was the idea of exploring the idea of, and I think this was probably like in the air because life has been so hard over the last 5-10 years, right? Politically, this predates the pandemic, but there's just so much going on in the world. At points, you stop and you ask yourself, why am I making video games? Why am I telling stories? You look at people that are, doing things that have a more direct, obvious impact. And so there was a little bit of like thinking about making things. When you work in video games, you're painfully aware of some of the issues around like how quickly things age, right? I made this game Silent Hill Shattered Memories that, has people who really love it. Something I'm very proud of. And it's almost impossible to play it now. You need to find an original Wii console, buy the disc, of which there weren't many, Plug all the things into your television. And even then, the state of the art has come on so that, the character models look simple. The environment texture detail is not as great as you remember it. And then, you have more extreme examples of like friends that have games on the App Store that can no longer be purchased or even installed because the OS has deprecated them. And I worked on this Legacy of Kain game for 3 years that got cancelled. This was just before I went indie. And I co-wrote that with an author I worked with, and we would talk about like the very primal question that we would have, which was, what medium is the best use of my time? So, he would write novels, and the novel, although there are, it's not quite as simple as people make out. There are editors and there are people involved in the process. But, in writing a novel, he got to write something very personal that directly spoke to the reader, had a lot of control over it. But the nature of book publishing was that, unless he became the next Harry Potter or whatever, then, a small number of people would read his books. And his books would consistently get incredible reviews, had a loyal fan base, but, the number of people that read them was limited. Whereas we were working on this big AAA video game, and we were making compromises every day, like fighting tooth and nail, but, to argue about how the story should be told, bits and pieces of detail and stuff. But we knew that at the end of the day, if it had come out, it would have had an audience of millions. And so we would have reached a very broad audience. But then we'd balance it up with, well, if the apocalypse happened tomorrow, there would still be hardback copies of your book that people could read, but this game would disappear. Even if the apocalypse doesn't happen, probably this game stops being playable or interesting to people in 10 years' time. So, especially working, I think, on the edge of technology, you think a lot about what it means to create broadly art or entertainment and put it out there. And so I think that idea of thinking about that as a loose thematic idea seemed very interesting to me, was exploring that. And then it then very quickly kind of made sense to do that through looking back at cinema, and it's neat to look back at like the 20th century cinema because it's in the rearview mirror, and think about it through the eyes to some extent of an actress, and think about what is left behind, how much of her is captured in these movies, and these kind of questions. So I think that that idea of doing something that more directly tackled the idea of a movie, the idea of exploring being creative, and the idea of putting out work, that kind of all sort of meshed together.
How did you gather this team around you? We have seen that Barry Gifford, the novelist who wrote Sailor Enola, was working with you. So Alan Scott and Amelia Gray. Those three people are storytellers who don't come from the video games world.
Yeah, that was the most fun part, because, and we kind of spoke to a lot more people. So we had this kind of, at some point where we decided that we were going to tackle these eras. And, we'd done a lot of research. And then part of that research was reaching out and speaking to people from the time to kind of run things by them and get their perspective on things. So that was fascinating. And, people are reasonably approachable and like to talk about, their glory days or what have you. And if they're involved in very significant moments in time and stuff, they were usually quite happy to jump on a phone call with us. And at some point we decided it would make sense if we could get people to come in and write on the actual movies who came from that era or had a connection to that era. And so there was a kind of task of going through and being like, well, who wrote all these good movies that we like, that we've referenced in these particular eras, and how many of them are still alive? how many of them are still working, and then from that subset, who is interested in talking to us. And there was definitely an interesting conversation in most of these cases early on where you would say, hey, we're making this video game. We'd be interested in you coming to write on it. And they would say, oh, I don't know anything about video games, but also that sounds kind of interesting and different and exciting. Am I going to have to do choose your own adventure things and figure out all these cool, exciting stuff? And we'd be like, no. Don't even forget we said video game. What we really just want you to do is come in and make a genuine movie that we're going to use. And you can trust us that it will make sense in the context. If you're just, and we had we had outlines and ideas for how these things should unfold. In some cases, reasonably specific because we kind of wanted them to fit into certain moments. But then we just kind of handed those off. Then the writers went away and, did their business. And so we made sure that we had full screenplays that made sense and that, you could have just handed off and someone could have gone and made this movie as just a normal movie. And, everyone, we definitely weren't paying people what they might get paid to write a movie, but it was kind of fun because people got to go write a movie, have fun with it, not worry about studio notes or kind of any of those kind of pressures. In the case of, this is slightly spoilery, but in the case of Barry, the idea there was to, so if you look into the production of the third movie, in Immortality, Two of Everything, there's an idea there that this movie starts as something quite different, and in the developing of it, changes. And Barry Gifford is involved in that story within our universe, and so Two of Everything starts as a specific adaptation of a story that Barry Gifford had written. So we kind of started with that adaptation that Barry had done, and then that morphs into what becomes Two of Everything, which is actually not dissimilar to the real life circumstances of the movie Lost Highway that he made with David Lynch, where it started off as an adaptation of a different Barry Gifford book. They did, I think, a decent amount of work on it, and then at some point, I think in his biography, David Lynch talks about it. There was a moment where he said, "You know what? We're clever guys. Why don't we just invent a new story? Why are we adapting this old one?" And there was 2 lines. I think there were 2 lines in the script they had, which David Lynch really liked, and I think one of them referenced a Lost Highway. I can't remember the other one. I think the other one survives verbatim in Lost Highway, but they kind of just took those 2 lines and a lot of what had, I guess, been kind of floating in the subtext, and they kind of then positioned that as the new movie. So there's kind of something similar happens here, which I think is again as part of this exploration of the what it is to be creative and how movies are made. One of the things that I find endlessly fascinating is when you dig into any given movie and look at the history of it, you realize how much things changed along the journey. Which always makes me laugh when people claim that video games can't be art because there is no control, there is no authorial control in the same way, and they'll point to this movie is a work of art because it was delivered exactly as crafted and intended by the author. And then you're like, well, yes, but they also made 20 other cuts of that movie. And they only chose this particular cut because of a particular audience screening. And when they set out to make this movie, they cast Harvey Keitel in it, and they shot 6 months of Harvey Keitel, and then they lost him, and they had to reshoot it. Or the one that's endlessly fascinating to me is Eyes Wide Shut, the Kubrick movie. He tried to make Eyes Wide Shut throughout his entire career. There was a version that was a comedy that was going to star Woody Allen, which that's a whole alternate universe that we dodged. At one point, Steve Martin was going to star in Eyes Wide Shut, and he had Jean le Carré, the list of famous writers that Kubrick brought in to write a treatment or a version of Eyes Wide Shut is bizarre. And I just love, because the more you dig into that, it doesn't in any way diminish the finished product, but I think it's an interesting part of it, right? And maybe that's kind of part of the ethos of Immortality, is to trick people, not trick them, encourage people to become as obsessive about watching a movie as I might be, right? Like for me, there is a joy in watching a movie more than once. There is a joy in analyzing a movie and looking at how it's shot and a particular moment. There is a joy to reading up on it, about the biographies of the people involved, understanding what happened behind the scenes, looking at, temporary scripts and things. And, in a lot of cases, it doesn't ruin. In some cases, it doesn't always, ruin the end product. It kind of almost enriches your understanding of it. And so, I think all of my games, on some level, are about encouraging people to be obsessive. I think, her story is like, be obsessive about what is being said, think about the subtext, pay more attention, don't just let it, float over your head. I think generally that's kind of what I'm pushing.
About obsessions, is it one of your goal to push video game out of its own obsessions, of its classic obsessions, and to look outside the box?
Yeah, I would say the thing that as a player of games, as well as someone that makes them, the narrowness in terms of just the types of characters we can talk about, the types of stories, the assumptions about gameplay, that has always been probably my biggest frustration. On one hand, it's partly because things take so long and are so complicated and are so expensive that, and I saw this directly with Silent Hill. So when we came in to work on Silent Hill, it was a horror video game. And at that point, the idea of what a horror video game was very rigid. It was essentially modeled on Resident Evil. You would have health kits, ammunition, puzzles and keys, monsters that would be, slow moving and essentially zombies, whatever they looked like. There would be lots of exploration and unlocking doors. And that was such a rigid kind of category. And if you're pitching to make a video game, and if it's going to take you 3 years, I mean, now it might take you 5 years, 3 years to make a video game, to get the money, you'd be talking to the executives who would be looking at what was the last big hit. So you'd have to tell them, yes, it's going to be like that last big hit that they started working on 3 years ago. We'll tweak it a little bit, like to make it a bit fresh, but not so much that it scares you. And then it takes you 3 years to make that. So just that, the pace of progress is so small. And I think a lot of that, we have this weird fusion in video games of like story genre and game genre, right? Which I think hampers us a lot. Because, in other storytelling mediums, you have the full spectrum of story genres, types of characters and stories you can talk about. And in video games, generally, that kind of has traditionally been a lot narrower. So, if you're trying to tell a story about someone that is not directly involved in physical conflict, you've kind of eliminating half of what a video game can be. Certainly when I was having to answer to marketing people, if your lead character was not aspirational in some way, either with their superpowers or their, fast cars or whatever, then for them, that was not a compelling pitch for a video game, which actually is why I loved working in horror. Like at that time, horror video games were the only video games where you didn't have to give the player a fun time. Every other video game, the test would always be, is this fun? Is this exciting? Are they having fun? With a horror game, you'd be like, yeah, they're not supposed to be having fun. We're trying to depress or bore them or scare them or whatever. But yeah, I think for me that, and that was, again, like one of the things I was pushing with her story was, let's trust the player. Give the player more freedom than we might. The other thing was, at that time, that felt like the biggest step I should make towards a different type of story, right? It was, this is a story set in 20th century England with this working class woman talking about her story. It's got like gothic edges to it. But this is a character and a type of story I have not seen in a video game. And I think it is compelling. Particularly, the thing that was always ridiculous was, even when I was working for publishers, I would pitch them like crime stories and police stories and thrillers with the, understanding that in every other medium, those stories are successful, right? If you have a TV station, you will have a cop show or a detective show. If you sell books, you're going to have a murder mystery, you're going to have a thriller. And it was interesting because the pushback from publishers would always be like, yes, in every medium but video games. That is true. And I think it did, if you interrogated it, it kind of came down to how much that genre relied on people and characters, right? A lot of it is talking and interpersonal relationships and kind of character dynamics. But yes, I did Her Story as an attempt to just kind of say, look, if I could step this far over and this is going to work, and then it did, and that was exciting. I'll be honest, I think when I did Telling Lies, I think there was also a challenge in trying to communicate what Telling Lies was. But with Telling Lies, I was like very confident from having done Her Story. And I was like, oh, I can keep going. I'll go even further. Let's tell a story that's about like adult relationships and touches on law enforcement and privacy and some of these interesting issues. And I think that was a harder sell. I think we also struggled because it was very hard to talk about that game without ruining it. And not even like in that there was a big twist, but I don't know, I was very precious about the opening hour, like 40 minutes to an hour of Telling Lies. When we tested on people who had no idea, they really enjoyed going in, making probably assumptions about Logan Marshall Green's character, whether or not they were a good guy, and then realizing the reality of things. And just that like initial wrong footing, I think, really added a lot to then the resulting experience. But it made it very hard to explain to people what the story was, what the game was. With Her Story, you said, oh, this woman is accused of murdering her husband. Did she do it? You get it. Luckily, with Immortality, it's like, this actress disappeared. We're going to watch her 3 movies and try and figure out what's going on. So I think on some, but it definitely felt like I was pushing into an area where it was much harder to kind of, work in those traditional kind of video game channels. But I think it continues to evolve. And, I think we'll see more and more. One of the things that I'm excited about with Immortality is the fact that we're going to be on Netflix. And, it's early days for Netflix. They're kind of testing this thing out. But I remember the first conversation we had with them, and they showed us their plans. The thing that really excited me was them putting games on the same page as movies and TV in a way that just really gave an equivalency between the mediums that I think is true, right? Like when Elden Ring blew up and people were talking about Elden Ring and it was the big new thing, that felt very similar to when, a show blows up, right? Game of Thrones blows up and everyone's talking about that. Like it really felt like we're at a point where enough of the people that are reading the entertainment press or are talking about things online are excited about this game. So these things kind of have an equal kind of weight. So it's very exciting just imagining seeing games on the front page, say, of Netflix. And suddenly it does break a lot of those boundaries down because you're like, oh, Netflix knows that I like thrillers and horror movies and dramas and blah, blah, blah. And that's the stuff it's arranging up here. So I could imagine it pulling games in that, touch on those themes. And now I'm like, yes, this is all content that I'm excited to enjoy. And you can make those connections in a way that's very different. Almost every video game store says, do you want to play a driving game, FPS, I guess an action adventure game, an RPG, right? Like that they have these rigid categories that, and then you'll have indie, all the interesting stuff that's kind of different, right? But, I think that that'll be kind of fun.
I was curious to hear you about your work on the actor direction, because one of the most beautiful aspects of the game is the way the player looks at Marissa, for instance. In every single piece of film, at the same time, we are looking at the character, for instance, Rosario in Ambrosio. in order to decipher the story of the movie, but we are also looking at an actress on the set with her frustration, her sorrow, her reaction to the way Arthur Fisher is directing her. And even before the post-production process and the ghost on the screen, there are an incredible amount of layers in each images. How did you manage that?
I mean, a lot of it is in the writing. And when I say writing, in the planning and research and kind of laying out of it. I have my guilty pleasure is reading like screenwriting structure books and things, right? All these gurus who are like, this is the shape of every story. And as somebody with a maths background, I'm always like, you're all kind of saying the same thing, right? You're just saying something can happen, then something else happens, then something else happens, right? It ends up getting very crude. But I boil it down. There's one theory they call the sequence theory, which is so simple. It shouldn't even be called a theory. And the idea there is if an individual scene is in itself interesting and exciting, then the rest of it'll work, right? It's like, well, yeah. And there's something I realized in making Her Story, and part of this came from when I was conceiving of Her Story, I pulled up a lot of real life police interrogation footage and transcripts. And I early on created a prototype that was based on a text transcript of a real life interrogation. And I kind of played it in Excel as if it was Her Story. And it played kind of well. Like, it was actually interesting. And I found myself uncovering aspects of this particular investigation through following certain word choices or through certain themes or whatever. And that was exciting to me. And so I kind of came away from that realizing that there were so many layers to this real life story in terms of the entire life story of this guy that was accused of murdering his parents in this one case. The methodology of the detectives in asking the questions. They would often ask him these kind of open questions, so he was forced to kind of talk at length and sort of pull in a lot of what was happening in his life whilst also trying to hide and suppress the crime. And my kind of takeaway from that was like, I just need to make sure I bake into this story enough layers that when people start to dig into it themselves, there's things for them to find, right? And I think a part of the nonlinearity is if I don't know exactly which scenes people are going to butt up against each other, I'm not laying out a very specific path to them. But if any given scene has 4 or 5 things happening in it, and this other scene has 4 or 5 things, there's a chance that 2 of those things will kind of spark off each other and have some synergy. So a lot of the preparation is quite methodically, or at least iterating towards this, making sure that every piece of the puzzle has more than one thing going on, right? So in the case of Immortality, it might be that, in this scene, we have the story of the movie, and so each scene should be interesting from the movie and move that movie plot forward in an interesting way. We should also see some element of craft, like see some interesting element of the process of shooting a movie that will kind of be interesting to us. There should be something happening to the cast, right? There's something happening to Marissa or whoever she's working with in the scene that is, completely off camera almost, but it is going to be affecting the scene that we can possibly detect. Maybe we have to put it together with 2 other pieces, but we'll detect it. And just kind of having that checklist as part of the writing process, so that going into a scene, I very carefully mapped everything out. And then, you end up with a script. You give that to the actors who, I think this is almost inevitable, but I've been lucky enough to work with actors who are very well prepared, take things very seriously. And what will happen is we'll share the script, and then we'll talk about the characters and the story. And that tends to then be me bringing all of this preparation into the room so that the actors know at any given point, coming into this scene, this is what's happening. This is where this is going. This is what this person's thinking, alongside all this, the rest of this. And then when you get to the, shooting in what are usually quite long takes or single takes, to some extent, then the actor is kind of on their own. And they're having to be present in the moment and just carry on with it. So, you have all of this thinking and everything's kind of thought out so that it's all there to draw upon. And then you're just kind of trusting in the moment, in, people's kind of talent to then, incorporate that in interesting ways. So there is always that kind of confidence going in, knowing that we've put so much thinking into the script that that's a good starting point. And then everything else is, everyone else bringing their craft to the table. So, from the production designers to the camera team, to costume, everyone is coming in and has this same wealth of kind of preparation to draw upon. And, so they're putting in things that you haven't necessarily planned or anticipated, but because everything is drawing on the same set of truths or references, it's all helping just kind of build up those layers. So yeah, it's just doing lots of work is part of the answer.
So you trust your actors as you trust the gamers.
Yeah, no, I think it's of any profession. I think actors are the ones that just blow me away. I'm in awe of what they can do. Because again, I've had, when I'm usually involved in the writing, I have a front row seat on how much thinking has gone in, and then we boil it down and boil it down and boil it down, right, to a single piece of dialogue or a little action line in the script. And then to give that to the actors, and they just, to see them walk out and they just do something with their eyes that pulls all that stuff back in, right, and communicates it to people is always amazing. So yeah, I'm generally being told, it's quite funny because coming from a traditional video games background, right? So before I started doing this, I was doing motion capture or voice acting direction. And, there's a certain way those things work that I guess is loosely similar to directing a movie, but quite different. And, I would be, as a game director doing motion capture, I didn't have the stature and the power of a movie director, and I wasn't shouting through a bullhorn or anything. And I was very much in the weeds in all of the logistical things, because, in a game where things are very dynamic and plug in different ways, you have to, some directors just walk onto the set and they read the script and, direct some character moments, but they don't need to worry about a lot of the logistics. So I've found that working with crews that, are used to making movies and stuff, everyone is always kind of impressed or surprised at how much preparation has gone on, at kind of how involved I am in some of the minutiae and how many answers I have to the questions. And there's the one piece of advice people usually give movie directors is, if someone asks you a question, give them an answer confidently straight away. That's kind of your job, because you have all these people who are extremely skilled and know what they're doing when it comes to cameras, lighting, lenses, costumes, makeup, set design, everything. They all know what they're doing, but there's so many moving parts that really kind of the role of the director is when someone asks a question is to say yes confidently, or give them direction confidently so they can then go on. Because if you don't answer quickly, or if you don't answer confidently, the whole thing will just kind of slowly kind of fall apart. But I think it's useful that usually this amount of preparation required for a non-linear video game means that pretty much any question that comes up has previously actually been thought out. So it's not always off the cuff. But yeah, I think it's, when you that gives you the confidence, I think, when you've had that much preparation, when you've thought things through that much, that you can just let people run with it. And that's, again, it's as much as the actors might get the same freedom as the players, I think I get the same joy from watching the actors kind of run with the scene as somebody might at the end of the day, sat watching the same scene and enjoying the same little things that I'm enjoying. So always try and kind of have that perspective.
We have to talk about it. We played we played Immortality, and when we are used to play video games, it's not a detail. This game shows a lot of flesh. Sex does not exist in video games, where it is reduced to cliche. Even though Eros is one of the main engines of fiction, was it obvious to depict sex as you did in Immortality?
Yeah, and I think it came out of. I mean, generally, I'm Europe. Well, I'm British because could say I'm European. That'd be easier. But I'm British, but it's quite different to how Americans view these things. But so I have a background. Like growing up, all of my favorite writers and film directors were all very interested in the mechanics of human love. And so growing up watching Ken Russell or Peter Greenaway or Derek Jarman, Adrian Lyne, watching all those movies, reading. I would mostly read, not in the original French, but as a young teenager, I kind of read voraciously, and I would read a lot of like kind of American sci-fi, pulp sci-fi, like Philip K. Dick and stuff. And I kind of had this mental thing that I would balance it by reading a lot of French literature, a lot of modern French literature. And to me, like it's not weird or surprising or strange that in telling a story about adult human beings, that sex would play a part, right? It's like you say, it's fundamental. And I think with this game, as soon as we knew that we were talking about this primal idea that maybe we create art as a way of living beyond death, right? Like as human beings, we're obsessed with our own mortality, and that's what makes us different to animals. And one way of we actually had this very complicated schema that the composer used to talk about the different themes in this game. But we kind of talked about like how are the different ways that human beings deal with their mortality. And it was like, well, there's the religious idea that we have an idea of an abstracted life after death that we kind of believe in, and there's the religious moment. There was the idea of kind of hedonism, of physical pleasure being something that allowed us to live in the moment and just kind of transcend the idea of death. And a lot of that would be like dance, food, sex. And then there was the idea of creating something which would live beyond us, which might be a piece of art or a piece of music or something. So I think as soon as we started talking about the human lifespan and about death, then you obviously have the corollary, which is sex. And as well, then when you combine it with movie making, and when you're looking at the 20th century of movie making, and you're talking about star power, there is so much tied up into star power and sex appeal. So much of the kind of excitement of movies is dealing with thrilling situation or sexy situations. And we kind of, we started off, at some point we locked into this idea of adapting The Monk, which is a tremendous novel from the 18th century, written by a 22-year-old British guy in a very short span of time. And it's the most, it reads extremely well now. Like it doesn't feel dated, but it's full of gothic sex and violence and all these things that are kind of dialed up and very extreme. This monk who's being tempted. And it was really interesting to us because we were talking about, this actress and what it means to be an actress and looking through the different periods in which, going from the studio system where they crafted the idea of a star or an actor to kind of like 70s New Hollywood, where a star felt like slightly more authentic, but still behind the scenes, there was a lot of control exerted by the directors, in some cases kind of in a personal way. And looking at Ambrosio, the adaptation of The Monk, it was clear that like The Monk is a story of a femme fatale, right? The character in that of Matilda is a classic femme fatale. And Ambrosio in this story is the pathetic male hero of a film noir. Like he's the guy that just he can't say no. He keeps doing the bad thing, and he's morally bankrupt, and he ends up being punished for it. So we were kind of aware that the monk starts with this idea of a femme fatale. And then we wanted to move into New Hollywood and see how that changed. Like, femme fatale was interesting to me because, especially when you look at classic Hollywood, it was often a very empowering role for a woman. Women got to have more agency as femme fatales. They got to be more in control of their lives, their sexuality. But at the same time, it is also a trope that exists to titillate a male audience, right? So we were interested in the kind of complexity of that. And then, you see in Minsky this being expanded into the kind of ambiguity that we love about 70s movies, where actually here you have a femme fatale that is more dimensional. The character of Marissa is interested in giving her more dimension, and then expanding on how that would look, how the transition we were seeing from like the 60s through to the 70s in terms of what you did see on screen and how that was depicted, and part of the development of this game was me rethinking my kind of blind love for these movies and directors, right? Because you look back, people now sort of look at the 70s as being, oh, this was a golden age for authentic, personal, intimate movie making. And, again, growing up loving Ken Russell and Nick Roeg and all these directors who joyfully put sex on the screen and joyfully have all sorts of things happening. And then you start to dig into the behind the scenes a little bit. And, we've seen it with other kind of boundary breaking things like, Last Tango in Paris, the kind of recontextualization of that when you realize what was going on behind the scenes. There was the Nick Roeg movie Performance with Mick Jagger and a whole bunch of people has like this scene on a bed where there's like 3 or 4 people all under the covers. And you see Nick Roeg talking about it. And he's excited. He's like, yeah, I just had the camera in my hand. I was under the sheets with everyone. There were just limbs everywhere. It was so like organic and free. And we really captured something. And then you see them interviewing the women who acted in that scene. And they were like, I just felt really awkward and really uncomfortable throughout the whole thing, right? So I think we were kind of constantly interested in, plugging into those primal questions that are part of a lot of stories and movies. But then thinking about what it means for the people actually shooting those scenes, what it means in terms of the power dynamics. But, I think that was part of just the interesting juggling of complexity. But yeah, I think it has that weird thing with video games as well, where certainly when the moral panic kicks in, there's always this difference with video games where it's assumed that in a video game, you're controlling a character and you are doing the things, and somehow this is meaningfully different from watching a character do a thing on screen, and it starts to get weird and muddy. It seems kind of ridiculous to me, and I think there are obviously huge implications for not talking about whole swathes of human behavior in a medium. It doesn't mean that when you do talk about them, people notice it more, right? Or make a bigger deal about it. But so I think it was always something that came out of the story, came out of the movies we were looking at, came out of the time periods we were talking about, and felt very natural. And we tried not to overthink like whether or not this was controversial for a video game. I think there are definitely. You can look in the history of video games and you can definitely point to games where people have said, we're going to put this in just to get attention, right? Or just to make a point. And it's going to feel quite kind of shoehorned in. But I think we were committed to it coming quite organically out of the material.
Without giving away too much of the plot, one of the most fascinating things about Immortality is the way it perfectly mimics cinema, but manages to break the one thing that unites absolutely all films, the way the image scroll. This forward motion of 24 frames per second. In French, le sens des images, the expression le sens des images refers to both the meaning of the images and this motion. I suppose in English there is something of a double meaning around the word direction. The direction of a movie and the direction, the movement. Does it seem relevant? And
this was definitely something that was really at the forefront of thinking about the game, and it partly came out of like making Telling Lies. And at one point, I think the script that we sent to Logan for Telling Lies on the front cover said an anti-movie, and there was a big understanding there that like by having things that in that game were very long takes, and by giving the player the ability to stop, start, rewind, fast forward, we were 100% not making a movie. There is the quote of Peter Greenaway gave a talk called "The Death of Cinema," and he stands on stage and he says, "Cinema died." I can't remember the date, but it's the date that the remote control was invented. To him, like as soon as we gave people the remote control, we were stopping essentially what cinema was, but opening up new possibilities. And I think that's really exciting to me. Again, I'm obsessed with Nick Rogue, who is a fascinating character. But if you read, there is no good autobiography of Nick Rogue, but he did give a speech before he died, which was divided into 3 parts. And it's hilarious because part 1 is like a very autobiographical, this is how I got my start in the film industry. And it talks about his life and his early days working as an apprentice. And then the middle section is kind of like his theory of film, which is him talking about how he likes to cut non-linearly to better match human memory and how humans experience things. And then the third section is Nick Rogue believing that through cinema we will transcend space and time and get a connection to a deeper universal spiritual truth, and maybe summon alternate dimensions or something. It gets very like hardcore spiritual and interesting. But he has this incredible anecdote. The first time he went into an edit suite, so he was like a 12-year-old boy, and he was apprenticing on one of the film studios in London. He went into the editing room and he saw a moviola for the first time. And the first time he saw someone push the button and the film went backwards, he was just like, because you just didn't in those days have access to the moving image in quite the same way, and just seeing the flick of a button reversing time kind of really blew his mind. And he was forever kind of chasing that buzz in his movies. He would sometimes use footage played backwards and things to try and give them a subjective feel. And I was similarly kind of excited by that. And I think there's like a fun to Immortality that in giving you this kind of fake moviola. There's a bunch of things we do, right? The first scene you see in the game is this VHS recording of a 60s talk show. So it's pretty, low quality and pixelated. And then when we tell you to zoom into it, and it zooms in, it breaks up into very chunky pixels. And then in other scenes, when you're zooming in, you're very aware of the grain. And just kind of reminding you that, in the same way that Goddard said cinema was the truth 24 times a second or something like that. In the same way that, oftentimes film people will remind you this is not a living person inside the screen. It's just 24 images. And when that happens quickly, your brain imagines that it's come alive. And sort of here, just really constantly reminding you of that magic by saying, this isn't a person. This is a bunch of colored dots on a screen. And if you zoom in, they become dots. But when you're back here, it's a living person, and it's exciting. So I think that one of the more exciting things about working digitally and doing these things is figuring out what exciting things happen when you step beyond that, like when you do give people that level of control. Because it's something that exists in books, right? When you read a novel, the way time works in a novel is very different, right? You read at your own pace, but in your head, it's happening in real time. Between 2 sentences, you can have like 100 years, or you can have all these interesting things that you hold together in your head. And I think sometimes people talk about my games as being kind of novelistic in just the way you kind of immerse yourselves in them. So definitely attacking that direction, the direction of time. It's just cute visually, right? Just sitting and playing things backwards. someone played an early version of this and described it as like a David Lynch simulator. It's like you just get people talking backwards and then make random, match cuts and stuff, and you can kind of create your own little mini weird moment. But yeah, I think it's, on one level, because it's a game and because you have buttons to press and because you have ostensibly a task to perform, I think people aren't necessarily, overanalyzing it, which is cool because they get to just kind of have that level of scrutiny of exactly what does it mean to make a movie? What does it mean to have, these moving images capture something? You think of film as capturing on camera something very alive, and I think there's like a thread, I think, through the game of that, thinking about why a movie is a special medium, that it is different in other ways, and there's something very magical about the extent to which you're capturing real life. I think there's a line from Marissa. I think she's quoting Derek where she talks about,
in an interview with Rosario and
yes, yeah, where she talks about, you're talking about photons bouncing off her skin, captured on this chemical medium, taken to a laboratory. But it's, there is literally a chain of physical touch between all these things, and then it hits your eye when you're in a movie theater, and there's something kind of very funky about that. So yeah, I think just, in the minute-to-minute play, in the same way that, when I play, you'll realize I'm quite obsessed with the Metroid games, but when I played Metroid Prime intently when it came out, I walked out of my house and was so much more aware of space and of how the world was laid out and three-dimensionality, right? I would look and I would be like, oh, I could jump and double jump and bounce off that thing. And suddenly, like, I was just more intensely aware of the three-dimensional world around me than I would normally be walking around. When I play Zelda: The Breath of the Wild and I'm walking across a field surrounded by cartoon grass with some beautiful audio of the grass blowing in the wind, I'm made more aware of and appreciate the pleasure of walking through a grassy field, right? There's this kind of heightened appreciation of things. So I think there's definitely an element of that, of, just having you give you a heightened appreciation or understanding of just the physical reality of what film is.
In the game, there's a success called Chekhov's gun, in reference of this dramaturgical process that states the only memorable details that should be kept in a fiction are those that are absolutely essential to the narrative. Her story, Telling Lies and Immortality, rely heavily on this idea, but almost by denying it. Because the player has to find what is important in this incredible abundance of details. How do you manage to find balance in this orgy of details? Is there a point where it is too much, or do you have so much faith in the player that you think that no matter how much details there are, he or she will find a way?
I think it's two things. One, I think on a level, there's a nice thing that happens where the player helps define what is important themselves. And I think I remember, because her story was very original at the time, I remember a lot of people were like, how did you make it feel like a story? How did it feel like it had the shape of a story, even though it was, not necessarily random, but like disordered? And I think inherently the player, who has a very deep understanding of stories and an interest in what is happening in this story, is to some extent shaping it. And so, even on a basic level of, you talk about, these details that may not be interesting, although they might have an inherent interest in themselves. If a player is digging into, is digging down a particular route, following a particular thread that is kind of low on drama, let's say it's not necessarily hitting big questions and the big intense moments. Like, if they're at a point in the arc of the story they're experiencing where they're comfortable with that, they'll keep kind of exploring these fun little things and noodling around in the side characters and the corners of the story. And if that's getting to the point where, they're getting ready to have something big and exciting happen, they can kind of, maybe if they're not aware of it, but they can correct that and be like, right, I'm going to go back to this key scene. I'm going to go back to this key thread. I'm going to follow this. I'm going to, in the case of her story, start typing big important words or big character names. Here it'd be, I'm going to go back to this scene. I'm going to go dig into this particular plot line that I've not completely kind of understood yet. So I think there's an element of, because players are kind of leading things, again, to compare it to Zelda again, if I play a Zelda game, a lot of times I'm going to be distracted. I'm going to go off after some little curiosity, and I'm going to, noodle around, find weird little places and things. Occasionally I might find like an extra heart piece or something to justify it, but that's not really the point. But if it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, it's enough aimless wandering, I'm like, well, I'm going to head back to, there's a big tower that I know I'm supposed to go to. So I'm going to head to that big tower. So in a game like that, it's very straightforward for the player, although they could do anything, to give a shape to their experience. So I think there's like an amount of that. The other thing is there is a lot of numbers and math stuff that I do with my games where, and this is kind of a tool set that's evolved across the 3 games, but once I have the script that is feeling pretty good, that lays out all of the content, that will get plugged into the computer, and the computer will then kind of analyze it. So in the case of Her Story and Telling Lies, it would look at the words that are used in the script and then figure out, well, how are these different scenes connected through the words that are used? Which of these scenes are easy to find, hard to find? Are the words that are used too much? Are the words that are used not enough? And then it would, tell me the 10 big problems, and I would iterate and tweak them all. So it might be like my favorite one in Her Story was the word marriage. So, the character getting married is quite a big deal, and thematically in Her Story. And the mechanic of Her Story was that you only see the first 5 clips a word is used in. So the computer says, hey, this word marriage appears in 7 clips. So currently there are 2 clips that are not being pulled up when someone types marriage. So then I get the really fun job of looking at these clips, deciding which 5 is the most poetic kind of encapsulation of the idea of marriage, and then removing the word from the 2 scenes, right, where I don't want that. So then you get this kind of nice cross-section of things. And the computer's constantly, then I plug it back in again, and then the computer says, oh, there's another thing I should tweak. So there's this really nice, and like with Her Story, because it was the first one I did, and no one was expecting the game, and I was doing it very cheaply, I did not test Her Story on human beings before it released. It was just me. But this process gave me the confidence to know that, like, mathematically, the world kind of connected in a nice way. And then usually what happens is, with these games, once I've done all that process, there will be a text version usually of the game that I can play. And it's no use to give that to someone else, right? Because so much of what you get out of these is the visuals, it is noticing details and all these kinds of things. But I can kind of play this text version, pretend, I just been dropped into this scene and someone said this thing, pretend I'm watching the movie unfold. In the case of Immortality, our prototype, basically you fed it a screenplay, and it took all the action and dialogue lines and beated them out so that they kind of happened at the right time on screen. So you kind of got a sense of how long this scene is, how much action is happening. And then any object that was called out in the scene description, or a character who would naturally be present, or a prop that was used in a piece of action, would get pulled out by the computer and stuck on screen as like a colored box. So you could, kind of play this text version of it, be like, oh, I'm in the scene where this is happening, these people are talking, and there's a such and such a thing on the screen at this point. Oh, that might be something that people would want to click on. So it was just a way to feel out, like, does this experience work? Does it unfold at a kind of good pace? So I think that's like a big part of it is, as well, just making sure, like I said, the writing process is all this preparation that goes into making sure the layers are there. And then there is this kind of step of kind of crunching the connectedness, mechanically kind of testing things out. Again, if you're making a first person shooter and you have a multiplayer map, you might now unleash a bunch of bots to run through the map, and you'll see where everyone's dying, right? You'll see if there are choke points in the map, or you'll have these kind of hotspots. So it's kind of a similar methodology to just kind of testing things out. But I think, it is that combination of thinking everything out, having computers do math, but then ultimately, again, trusting the player that they kind of know how to make a story happen, right? They will follow things that, if the core experience in these games is usually saying, what's interesting to you? What do you want to click on? What do you want to type? That helps people kind of make it interesting.
Since we're talking about math, are you cheating? Is there behind the match cut system a predetermined order of importance of each row? Does it point to more important videos as the player progresses in the game, or is it totally random?
There's like a whole brain behind it. I mean, I say brain. If I was giving you the marketing pitch, I'd say we have an AI director, right? It's like a bunch of algorithms. So this is another thing that like I'm obsessed with when I make games, and this goes back to like this is how Silent Hill Shattered Memories worked. That game was constantly shuffling and tweaking content behind the scenes based on a lot of numbers. And for me, that's magic. Like a traditional choose your own adventure is all branching paths, right? It's 1 or 0. It's did this happen? Yes, no. Does the player go left or right? And it's quite brittle. What I like to do is have lots of nice, varied numbers and vectors, and you can then like do tests of them and determine affinities and choose what might be the best thing to do in this scenario. So there is this kind of AI editor that if you click on something, looks at all the possible places it could go to from this point, and it kind of picks things out. It has like a sense of aesthetics in terms of, and it's not foolproof. What might be a good point to cut to? It doesn't want to step on lines of dialogue. It wants to make sure that the object looks nice on screen. It will look at the content of the scene, and if it will try and in some places extend, like if there's a current sort of thematic thing that the player seems to have been digging into or experiencing, it will sometimes try and extend that. It kind of has a lot of things it tries to do to create some kind of pace and pick things that would be interesting to jump to at that point. So it's
I had exactly this intuition.
But yeah, I just love systems like that, because I'm like, if you make a choose your own adventure and there's a problem, or you just don't think it's playing right, to change it, you have to change the whole tree, right? Whereas when you have these kind of systems, you can say, well, we should put more weight on the aesthetic side of things, or we should put more weight on maintaining plot integrity, or we should put more weight on, maintaining dramatic intensity or whatever. So you can kind of tweak these things, and I like to tweak. But yeah, that's one of the things that I find really interesting. It's the thing that amazes me that we don't see in normal television now, right? We have in something like a Netflix that is doing all of this math to figure out how to present the storefront. It's doing all this, vector math of saying, Sam really likes Brad Pitt movies, but he also likes thrillers. And I don't think it does this anymore, but it used to have those sentences where it'd say, you like dark, mysterious thrillers with strong female protagonists filmed in Eastern Europe, right? Or whatever. It would have these kind of long chains. But, it has all that incredible math and discoverability stuff. It has like this really deep picture of who you are as a human being. There was the incredible moment that I was blown away by when they Netflix put out a show called Love and Robots, and it was an anthology show. So they had 10 episodes, and with an anthology show, you could, in theory, put the episodes in any order because they don't connect. And so there's a real decision you have there, right? Of, do I put the best episode first? So people keep, but then if you do that, it's just going to be downhill, right? Do you put the most mainstream kind of episode first and then have the really good one and pace it out? How do you do that? And what Netflix did was different people got different orders because they love to test and look at math, right? But there was a journalist in America who was gay, and he logs in and starts watching Love and Robots. And the episode he got first was an episode that was particularly gay. And then he had a straight friend who starts watching Love and Robots, and he gets an episode that is particularly straight. And they're like, holy shit, Netflix knows that I'm gay and is making decisions based on it. Like, that's terrifying that Netflix is tracking my sexuality and can even detect it. And it's like, well, it's probably easy to detect that based on what you're watching. But and Netflix had to come out with a statement, and they were like, no, like, it was just random. Like, we just gave people different random orders. It just so happened that you saw this pattern. We are not tracking people's sexuality. We're not like invading their privacy in this way. But I was like, that was kind of exciting. Like, it was exciting that he felt the creepiness of being seen by the algorithm, right? By his entertainment watching him back. But I'm also like, I would love for, it would be cool to watch a Netflix show where my version was a bit different, right? Or we got different pieces and different digressions. That was always when I was trying to pitch people telling lies, that was always my pitch was, I think at the time, like Breaking Bad was the big show, and obviously a very successful show. But there was that issue they had where, because it was a network TV show, you had a protagonist. And then everyone else in the show was, the B character. So you had Walter White, the anti-hero, doing all his stuff. And then the character of his wife, Skylar, her job in that TV show would always be to push against what he's doing, right? To be a piece of friction, to be a problem for him. And as the show goes on, right, and you realize that unless you're one of these kind of I'm the one who knocks people, you realize that Walter White is not a good guy, right? And the show is not necessarily positing that he's a good guy. And by the end of it, like, it's quite cool when he has a moment of clarity and acknowledges he's not doing any of this. He's not doing any of this to help his son or whatever. He's doing it for his own personal gratification. But, because that was a single linear show that was being broadcast to the world, you had to shoot for the middle ground almost, right? Of like, what are people going to get away from this? And a version of Breaking Bad that I would have loved to see would be the version where the people who are not getting the message, right? The people who are like, Walter White is awesome. I just want to see him blow things up more. You could have given them a version where you pushed the dark, you pushed the judgment on him a little bit more. And for people like me who are watching it going, well, Skylar actually is right in this scene. Like, she's, and they, that character was as well written as they could be, and the acting was as good as it could be. But the character, by nature of being a B character, did not get the chance to shine. And what I was positing with Telling Lies was, we had, a bunch of characters in that story who, in a traditional TV show, would have been the B character, who would have had less lines, less screen time, less agency in the story. And what I was really interested in doing was, because it wasn't linear, because it wasn't a 45-minute TV show, having 4 characters who are meshed in the central narrative, who get equal amounts of stuff, and based on how you're watching it, they could end up actually, being your A character. And they're the ones that you actually plant your POV on. But yeah, I just, all anything to do with algorithms, I kind of find fun. I think as a writer, like, if I try and write choose your own adventure stuff, I find it very limiting, because I'm constantly thinking about plot, constantly thinking about plot consequence, and it becomes very mechanical. Whereas when I write for things that have these mushiness to them, I'm always just writing what's interesting in the moment, and then I can attach a tag to it afterwards, and that will then help the computer do all the magical stuff. I think Inkle, who did 80 Days and Heaven's Vault, very different games to what I do, but they have a similar kind of ethos, which is, a lot of their kind of structure is driven by stats and numbers and clever math. So they can just write stuff, right? They'll be like, oh, I'm going to write an interesting way this scene could turn out. And when they write it, they don't even know they don't know what actions the player would have to take to make that happen. But they just have this confidence that because they attach math to it, that there are ways to get there based on the 100 things the player has done up till that point. As a writer, that's really fun because you just let the characters do things. You just kind of write the scenes that are interesting, and not have to worry. So, when I made Immortality, I was not thinking about the web of possible ways that you could reach scenes, right? I'm writing a scene. I'm not thinking like, to get here, someone has clicked on this and then clicked on this and then clicked on this, because that would have just crushed me. That actually was the first 5 minutes of developing Her Story. When I had the very loose idea of Her Story, I was like, well, geez, I will need to get some flowchart software. And I started thinking like, oh, you could search for this thing. And very quickly I was like, I just don't think it'll be any fun developing it in this way. And that's when I kind of discovered the other stuff. But
one of the consequences is the ending problem. Not problem, but reality in your games.
Yeah.
And after having spent around 5 hours of Immortality, I've played 20 hours, and I'm considering I'm almost finished the game now. But after 5 hours of games, I found a video that triggered the ending credits, but I couldn't figure what it meant at the time. How do you deal with specific accidents like this one? And is this an accident? I don't know. I really don't know. And how do you deal with the question of the ending in your games?
It's definitely one of the more interesting questions. And even back, so when I did Her Story, the first version, I kind of, that was essentially a playable alpha. There was a point where I did not have an ending. And I remember talking to a bunch of other game developers about it, and they all said, well, look, if this was in an art gallery, this was a piece in an art gallery, this would be fine, right? You walk up and sit and look at a painting, there's no definitive end. That would make sense. But if this is a game, I want an ending, and it's not because I want things to be clean and tidy, it's because I want permission to walk away. Like if I feel like I've pretty much seen everything, like I want permission to just walk away from the game. So I don't feel like I've massively screwed up, or I'm not missing like half the game. And games are weird because if you buy a book, if you get a movie, you know how long it is. You know when you finished a book, right? It might be that you're reading a Gene Wolfe book and having finished it just means you have to reread it 4 times. So you haven't really finished it. But it's very convenient in all those mediums that you know when to get up and walk out the cinema because the lights come up and it's finished. So that was always the thing on my mind, was giving people the permission of like, look, I think you've got enough out of this that if you feel like I'm done, I can walk away. And that would be the equivalent to me of me finishing the first read of a Gene Wolfe novel or any other novel that requires me to think, right? I finished the novel and I'm like, oh, okay. Like I had some catharsis. There was like, some kind of ending, but I feel like there's stuff there that maybe I can dig into. And then you can go back and keep going. It's slightly different, but I'm gonna have to pay some royalties to Nintendo if I keep referencing them. But the problem I always have with Zelda games, and actually Breath of the Wild solved it for me, but a traditional Zelda game, I'm playing it and I'm constantly going off the beaten path, and I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily always pursuing the ultimate high level goal because I'm enjoying myself so much and I want to go and explore this little forest or these little caves. find the little secrets and stuff. And but at some point, like, I'm gonna hit the ending. And I don't ever want to stop playing a Zelda game because they're fun. But usually, if I'll hit the ending and I'll have, I don't know, say 70% completion. And I want to keep playing. So I'll have finished the game. I'm done. And then the next 30% is the least. Maybe initially it's fun because I'm now kind of digging into some of the more gnarly secrets or whatever. But at some point it becomes tedious because I can't put this game down until I've got 100% of the spiders or whatever. And it stops being fun. And there are games that have tried to solve this, and it was horrible. Like there's Star Fox Adventures. When you got to the end game, when you got to the final bad guy, they just shut the world off, so you couldn't go back and get 100%. They were like, no, it's all exciting now. Go and kill the big dinosaur, and that just felt horrible. And I think one of the things that worked for me with Breath of the Wild was the game was so big and rich and all-encompassing, and it didn't give a shit about its collectibles, right? Famously, if you collect all the little leaf guys, you get a piece of poo, which is quite different, right? To, I think all the previous Zelda games would have a treasures screen that would say there are 100 golden spiders. And I'd be like, oh, shit, I need to get all the 100 golden spiders. And I think what Breath of the Wild did for me was say, look, at some point, go and kill Ganon. You could do it right. You could do it at the start of the game if you really want to push things. But, at some point, go kill Ganon. But this world will just be there for you to drop into and find stuff. And I feel like I will never exhaust Breath of the Wild. I feel like there's just going to be stuff there that I will never find. And so I don't feel the pressure 100% it. So I think there's always an attempt with my games to be like, here's a point where you've kind of got a sense of the key thing that's going on here. You got a sense of the key story. You've seen a lot of the bits that help you connect things. I'm going to give you a little cathartic way out. And if you've been playing this, I'm always amazed at people that just sit and play my games until the credits without stopping. Like, I sent an Immortality code to a friend, and they were DMing me on Twitter whilst I was asleep, and I realized they'd be going from like 12 p.m. till 7 a.m. And then they were like, screw you, I have to go to work now. But tell those people you can stop now. You can go use the bathroom. Like, there's a point, and if it's someone that wants to just kind of have a very, not service level, but like, have the experience, but they don't want to be too obsessive about it, then that's maybe a point where they can walk away and be like, oh, I kind of have the sense of that, in the way that they might go and see a mystery movie and have really enjoyed it and kind of taken something away from it, but maybe didn't completely understand the mechanics of what's going underneath. And I mean, Telling Lies was interesting because I did there was some sleight of hand in how we did it in that game, where there was a time of day was passing. So the conceit was this character was attempting to search through this hard drive, and there was some time pressure because the authorities were on their way or might be on their way. And so as you explored Telling Lies, the clock would advance, things in the background would change, and time would progress, and then the game would finish in time for the sun coming up and dawn. And this was all sleight of hand. Like, it was not progressing in real time. You could play the game forever, and the authorities would not kick your door in. But a lot of people assumed there was a hard time limit, and that was a game where you had to click a button to essentially summon the ending. It was like, okay, if you feel like you're done, click this button. And a lot of people would tell me that they clicked that button because they were panicking. They were like, I don't want to get caught. I need to click this button. And I was like, oh no, they would never have come. Like, it's fine. Like, we were, just faking this time passing. It was fun. With Immortality, it's a little bit more forceful because we wanted this sense with Immortality that there is some malevolence, not necessarily malevolence, but like there is something there that's pushing back a little bit, that is kind of watching you. And so, yeah, there comes a point where that is what kind of gives you your little beat. And I think the kind of endings always give you a teeny piece of extra kind of POV, whether that's just emotional or, I mean, in the case of Her Story, it kind of recontextualizes the narrative. I think in Telling Lies, it's mostly kind of cathartic and kind of emotional. You know, I want someone to put down Her Story or Telling Lies or Immortality when they feel good about putting it down, but with the knowledge that, like, if there's a rainy day and they want to come back to this and they dig, there's a chance they'll dig up some other fun little nugget and find something. Her Story actually allowed you to see a grid that showed everything. And I was always terrified by how much that made people want to 100% the game, which had never been my intention. My intention was always like, you know, I can't imagine people will play this in more than X hours. Like, I think people will get far enough and they'll have seen enough cool stuff and then they will be happy to walk away. But just having that screen there meant people were like, I've got to find these clips. I've got 2 missing clips, so I've got to find them. And so I kind of pulled back. On Telling Lies, there was a report screen that gave you that information because people wanted to know it. It's maybe even more pulled back in Immortality because there is slightly more of an air of mystery and hidden things. There are, you know, platform achievements so that you will get an achievement if you've seen absolutely everything you can see, but it's less of a thing that we're necessarily encouraging people to do. So again, it's, you know, if you go to an art gallery and look at a piece of sculpture, obviously that's devoid of narrative. So it's maybe easier to decide you've had enough time wandering around and looking at the sculpture, and you'll come back another time to look at your favorite sculpture. So it's, you know, it's definitely interesting and challenging. I don't know if there's cleverer solutions, if there's, you know, there's different interesting ways of dealing with these things. Obviously, Immortality doesn't really have, in the same way that Her Story and Telling Lies did, does not have like a protagonist. So it was easy in the sense of Her Story to be, you know, part of the twist of getting to the end of Her Story was realizing there was a protagonist, and that they had a specific identity, and that recontextualized things. And, you know, with Telling Lies, there was a protagonist who was much less of a surprise, but had some kind of, I think the idea was that their emotional journey would somewhat mirror yours, in their kind of judgment of events that had occurred. And, you know, here, I think when we talked about it internally, it was like, well, the protagonist in Immortality is the player. Like, we want, you know, the journey is essentially theirs, and everything that is being done to the protagonist is the stuff that we're doing to the player in what we're showing them and subjecting them to. You know, in some ways, you have less, you know, it's easy to say this character is finished now.
Game after game, it becomes more and more obvious that you always talk about the creation of stories in your games, the one that we tell ourselves and the one we tell to others.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that I get really interested in is the idea of identity. And obviously we have an idea of who we are in our heads that is entirely invisible, and we then communicate that to other people, and we can choose how to express ourselves, right? We can choose to project a different identity. You know, when you are interacting with other people in your lives, clearly this character is the invention of your brain, right? Like, we can never truly like have the measure of another human being. It's always our version of that person. And so, you know, everything is so deeply subjective, and informed by our own kind of perspective. That's something that I think is really fascinating. And I think it does, you're saying about stories, when you think about the point of stories, I think a lot of times we tell stories to bring people into our perspective, right? And to try and concentrate on communicating something, and expressing ourselves. So I think there's a lot of kind of synergy there. But yeah, it's definitely, that is, you know, continually interesting to me. And I think when, you know, when I made Her Story, I realized I was making a game. At some point, I realized I was making a game about my two grandmothers, and who were people who I only knew as my grandmothers. So they were both, cuddly maternal figures who, at that point, did not have careers, and particularly with her story, I was really interested in how, for them living through the kind of earlier parts of the 20th century, as women, like they didn't actually have a lot of choice in how they lived their lives. And I remember there was a photo of my grandmother in her house where she was very young and she was on the stage, glamorous and singing. And she had been a singer and she'd been forced to cut that short when the war happened. And then she got married, become a mother, and got a job as a cook. And looking back at that, it was amazing to me that, she had this other life and this expression that had been cut short, and like she'd been forced to kind of then exist in this other track, and just became aware of how little I genuinely knew this person, right, and how much of it was informed by my thoughts, and then thinking what it was like for her and my other grandmother, that the version of themselves that they projected on the world was very constrained compared to what they might have wanted to do. So that was kind of my interest there. And then obviously with Telling Lies, the larger plot there is a great framework and conceit to think about how much we might know kind of our intimate partners and the people that we're closest to. The real life story that game is based on, I had a visceral reaction to it when this horrible crime and scandal broke out in the UK that was dealing with undercover cops. And there was a woman who had been in a relationship with a guy who she thought was a green activist for several years, became pregnant with his child, had his child. He then disappeared, vanished in confusing circumstances, and she can never track him down. 10 years later, she opens up the newspaper and sees a picture of this man on stage addressing the police federation, and he's like a high-up policeman. And she's like, oh shit, this is the guy. Like, this is the love of my life, the father of my child. And he's not who he said he was. This was all a complete lie. And to me, like the visceral, like, how does your brain deal with that, right? And that's like the worst version of a bad breakup, right? Or the worst version of thinking someone is something and they're not, or just realizing that, people are different people in different circumstances. So that was like a very extreme and dramatic kind of to thinking about that. And certainly with the technology in Telling Lies, it was really interesting to read about how technology is changing how we relate to each other, how much of ourselves we share with the world, how much of ourselves we share with the state through just being surveilled constantly, and the ways in which just kind of basic body language changes when we're talking over computers and things. So that felt like it was all kind of plugged into the same thing of like how we think of ourselves, what, how truthful we are to ourselves. I think that like the core, the biggest absurdity in Telling Lies is that Logan's character is constantly lying to himself, and it's such a deep-seated lie that when he's forced to break, when he finally faces up to it, it essentially breaks him. And then with Immortality, you start definitely pushes it more into the question of storytelling, right? And what is actually being depicted on screen, how much is the character, how much is the actor, the extent to which playing a certain role, I think this is particularly true in Marissa's case, like playing a certain role might transform you. I've spoken to actors who, have said that, playing a certain role for a length of time, playing a character that goes in a certain direction and having to be present and live as that character, changes them, right? It's becomes part of them almost. And that's, fascinating. And, when you meet actors, a lot of times you meet actors or singers, you find that these people that you think are extremely confident and charismatic, actually a lot of it comes from, when they started out in life, they didn't have that confidence. And the acting was a way of actually projecting a persona. And that's where a lot of, their skill comes from. So yeah, it's definitely all You'd have to speak to my therapist to find out where it comes from. How much of myself I'm exposing here, but yeah, I'm endlessly fascinated by that idea, and it's maybe it's why these games I'm making are attempts to make films more novelistic, right? Because I don't think this is necessarily true at all, actually, but the bad piece of writing advice people are always given is, if you want to tell a deeply personal story, if you want to tell a story that is happening inside someone's head, then you shouldn't do it as a movie, right? Movies are for external action. Go write a book where you can hear the character's thoughts and deal with inner monologues. But I don't know. I just think if I look at an actor's face, I can tell what they're thinking. And so I think a lot of my favorite movies are actually the movies that deal with inner conflict and characters' inner spaces, and find ways to kind of explore that through the camera.
About your games, or your three last games, how do you explain the fact that despite their anonymous critical reception, your games have hardly any airs? It seems for us like an aberration in an industry where every good idea is quickly reused by other, but yours, nope.
It was funny because when Her Story came out and it was a hit on the App Store, the first thing I heard was like, oh, you'll get like the clones, you'll get some clones, right? Because that was pretty much how it worked back then. If you're an indie dev and you made a cool game, people would clone it, sometimes more successfully than you had done. And I think it really I think it has to come down to these things are just hard, right? You could obviously make a bad. I think even trying to make a bad Her Story, Her Story being the cheapest to make, like just making a bad Her Story, I think it would quickly become apparent that it was bad and it was hard to do. But then you have the additional complications of like having to film stuff, and even if again, Her Story was an example of a low budget film shoot. But I had an actress, Viva, who I'd worked with for a year before and was great and accomplished, and we put all this effort into the writing. Because I think, if you're cloning Candy Crush or you're cloning Flappy Bird, you can explicitly see the mechanics on screen and replicate them, change the graphics, tweak some numbers, whatever. But if you try just copying what's on the screen with Her Story, you then realize that, oh, actually there was a year before this of like writing and planning, and it becomes tricky. So I think that practically there's probably easier games to copy that have sold more copies, right? So it's just, and there definitely in the last year, I feel like there have been a couple of very literal Her Story clones specifically that have finally showed up. So, at some point we might see more of it. I've definitely heard there have been devs that have told me they were inspired more loosely by Her Story. There's a couple of games that like had a novel take on text input. A couple of the kind of lost phone games. They became kind of a genre. I think some of the devs there were like, oh yeah, we were inspired by the way in which Her Story took place in this computer desktop and stuff. So I think people have taken pieces, but yeah, it is just too much work, and which is another thing I have in common with the guys at Inkle is like we kind of have this philosophy that is. And I think this is like how magic works, right? I don't really know much about magic, but the way to make a magic trick is to put in so much work, so much preparation that no one else would even think of doing that much work to then make something appear as if it's magic, right? Is the best magic tricks kind of work in that way. And so I think, the secret, like the reason Inkle's games work is because when they made 80 Days, they just sat down and wrote 5 million words. They were like, how did you give this impression that you could go anywhere in the world? And they were like, because we sat down and wrote everywhere in the world. My favorite example actually is Scribblenauts.
Yes.
I remember when Scribblenauts first appeared at E3, there was a demo and everybody thought it was fake. Everyone was like, this has to be a trick. You can go up and type any word and the thing will appear on screen. And people would queue up and they'd be like, I'm going to get them. And I'd type something and it would work and they'd be like, oh my God. And it was to the point where it was, people were like, are we being, are people somehow suggesting to us what to type? Like, is there someone behind the scenes, like quickly drawing these things? And then I guess Liz England was one of the designers, did a talk about it. And what they did for Scribblenauts was they got every dictionary and every encyclopedia, and the designers sat down and went through in alphabetical order and just added every word. They just did it, right? They just said, they went, look, there's this many words. If it takes us an hour to set a thing up, times that by number of words. This is how many designers we have. Like, yeah, we can just about do this, right? We just need a tool that will allow us to quickly create something and give it attributes or whatever, which is, part of the clever thing. But so yeah, I think for me, a lot of the magic, in inverted commas, in my games is not necessarily just from the conceit, right, or the structure, or just the fact it's using video or whatever, but it is the work that goes into it. So that's not the easiest thing to clone. Whereas, yeah, you could clone Candy Crush in an afternoon and slap your sprites on it. Probably wouldn't do great, but maybe you got a chance if you get in there quick when Flappy Bird's happening. Was it Wordle? Like, Wordle's the best example, right?
Yeah.
When Wordle blew up, like the effort to code Wordle, like a good coder could do it in a couple of hours, right? So it was easy for them to capture the genius of Wordle and just stick it on a phone, and in a slightly evil way. But I think that the more richness there is in the content, the harder it is.
We have a last question, I think. Are you interested in the community and experience sharing aspect in video games? And do you take this aspect into account while creating? And last of it, have you thought about the potential multiplayer aspect of a Sam Barlow game?
No, I think
Okay.
I definitely, like I say, when I test these things, I test them and I play it myself and I try and put myself in the mind of someone playing it. And I'm very old-fashioned with video games. So for me, I mean, actually, it's not really true, because when I grew up, I would play video games with my brothers mostly, right? There were three of us and we would play games together, taking turns, or it would be a multiplayer game. So that was always in my past. But definitely, I guess, I love going to watch movies and sitting in the dark and watching the movie, right? And I love reading a book. A book is a very solitary experience. And so definitely the way I'm making experiences in my head when I'm making them, the way I'm thinking about making them personal, intimate, is I'm imagining a single person playing them. But then this marvelous thing happened of, when Her Story came out, people are like, oh, I played this with my significant other and we had an incredible time. And it really came alive because we were discussing it and seeing different things in it. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's, and that's always exciting to hear. And I think, it works because if I play a normal video game, the person that's holding the stick is the one that's having all the fun. And, watching someone else play a game in that manner is never that much fun. Certainly not if you're sat on the couch with them and you want to take over. But there is an element to the way my games play that there is no real penalty to not being the one in control, because you're watching and discussing and talking things through. So I did remember talking about one point. This wasn't on these last three games. This was mostly a commercial thing. So I remember after we'd done Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which spent all this money in giving people a very unique and subjective experience, the publishers thought that was bizarre. They're like, so you spent all this money and they don't see it, and they don't even know that they're not seeing it. That was the thing that got to them. And I think at the time, I guess Sony had just done Heavy Rain, and they were also amazed that they had spent all this money on stuff players would not see. And that was when they were talking about stuff that I think Quantic Dream did since then. I think as Dusk Falls has done, this idea that, like, if you're doing all this branching narrative where you have all this redundancy, we're going to show them the tree so people realize how clever the game is, and they're going to see the stuff they've missed. And I personally strongly dislike that. I really feel like that's showing your tricks, and it diminishes the joy of discovering things, or a feeling like you had a path through things, or there was any agency that you had. But I do remember we were pitching a game that it was more of a conventional game, but it was close to Shattered Memories, and somewhere between Shattered Memories and A Her Story in terms of how freeform the narrative was. And the publishers would not give up on this thing of, like, we want people to know how much money we spent. Like, we can't have them not know this. And the thing we suggested there, which actually I didn't hate as much, was, well, how about letting you see what your friends are doing? But it wasn't in, a lot of these choose your own adventure games now, it'll be like 20% of players did this. And again, to me, that kind of takes some of the fun out of it. But I remember we had something that was slightly more analog. But, you could imagine playing an Immortality. And really, it was being the equivalent of, if I'm playing Immortality and my friend is playing Immortality. And actually, this was always the most joyful bit of focus testing. We didn't have an in-person focus test for Immortality because COVID and everything. But on Telling Lies, we had a lot of in-person focus tests. And the joyful bit was we'd let them play for 3 or 4 hours, and then we'd put them in a room together, and everyone would have filled in a form and described the story in their own words and said some things. But then we would just let people talk. Or if we were being sly, we would let them have lunch and then just listen into what everyone was saying over lunch. And some of the coolest stuff was when people would volunteer, like, oh, but I think this is the case because I saw this thing happen. And someone else would be like, oh shit, like you saw what? That sounds amazing. I never saw that. Like, that's really cool. I'm going to go back and dig around. But, there was something much more organic and fun about people discovering things through their friends or through, other players, which I think is, again, if I jump back to like Elden Ring and me not wanting to cheat by looking at the FAQ and seeing like, how do I complete this quest line? But the difference there is you have a community that is helping each other and is discussing and evolving their understanding of a game. And I think that just feels kind of more fun. So, I think there's already kind of a natural multiplayer to these games in the discussion of them is in itself inherently fun when people, have their opinions and theories and talk about what they've seen. That becomes very interesting because you may have seen different things, or you saw things but in a different light, or you have different theories. And that is this kind of free multiplayer that doesn't require any programming. But I'm still like the again, like this for me, this idea of an Immortality project, I still in my head have the idea of a game that is just delivered fully formed and it's there. And if the apocalypse happens, if someone found power, they could sit and play it and enjoy it in one piece, right? So you wouldn't need another player to log in. You wouldn't need an online service or a server or anything like that. So, maybe as I soften in my older age and I get used to the inevitability of everything becoming one giant multiplayer game, I'll engage more directly.
It's not an obligation. Thank you very much. I have a quick questions. You don't have to make a large answer, but it's a set of 9 questions that we ask all your guests in Silence on Joue. Are you okay to answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm good to go.
So, what's your favorite controller or mouse button? You can elaborate a little bit.
I have some, yeah. I loved, I don't think this ages well, but like I loved the GameCube controller when playing Metroid Prime, and the way the triggers would click in a way that really felt like it replicated this powerful armor that the character was kind of having to heft around. That was something that I loved. These days, I am very much in love with. I've never really liked the stick clicks. They've always been like an annoying button in most games. But when we put the stick clicks in to make the Moviola spin through the footage really fast in Immortality, I just loved it. And it felt so fun because it really did feel like I was pushing a clicky button on an old machine. So I found a way to love the stick clicks.
In video games, the deaths you hate.
Oh, old school Resident Evil games, dying when I haven't saved for like 3 hours. I had a period in my life where I was getting up really early because my wife was leaving. She had like a big commute. So I would get up like 3 hours before I had to go to work. And I remember playing, it was Resident Evil 1 or Resident Evil 2. And, because you had like the limited ink ribbons or whatever in that game, like you couldn't always save when it made sense to save. So I'd play for like 2 or 3 hours and it would be time to go to work, but I wouldn't be in a position to save or like be the right place to save. And then if you died, in one because you didn't want to waste an ink ribbon. It was just excruciatingly painful. In a way that, when people talk about those classic games, it's like, yeah, well, death meant something, right? It was scary. It's like, yeah, it was scary, but I don't know, like in a different way. Scary like taxes, right? Not death.
The sound or the noise that you like in video games?
I think this would be the your boots make when you jump or double jump in Metroid Prime. There's this little, like, that jump is exquisite, and you do one jump, and then the second jump you have like these little nozzles in your boots, and it goes. It's so beautiful.
And the noise that you hate in video games?
Oh, this is, yes. I think this was in Thief as well as Thief 2, maybe Thief. There was an enemy in Thief that was this kind of undead zombie with chains. And, in Thief, you would have to sit in a dark corner, face the wall, and just not move and hope that the things hadn't seen you. And you're pretty sure they wouldn't see you, but you could never be completely sure. And you would hear these chains clink, clink, clink. That used to just absolutely terrify me. I only found out like a few years ago you could kill those guys if you had holy water arrows. I never knew that in the game. So they were always just extremely terrifying to me. So that would be the noise I hate.
What video game adaptation, a book, a film, a series, or other, would you make you dream?
I feel like I did a lot of adapting, at least of game IP, I guess, in my early days. So I kind of got it out of my system. I would obviously, if anyone's listened to this, would love to do something fun with Metroid. I feel like that's most of the games I love. I wouldn't want to touch because I wouldn't want to screw them up. But I feel like I could do a thing, have some fun with Metroid. Outside of that, I've tried a couple of times. I pitched things that were kind of evoking, like kind of late period J.G. Ballard. Like I love. We had a Silent Hill game we were pitching that took place in a gated apartment complex that was very Ballardian. I think it would be a very hard commercial proposition, but something like the Atrocity Exhibition would be a very strange and interesting video game. So yeah, maybe, I don't know. Again, probably I have no idea how I would do this, but like I've read so much of like Philip K. Dick when I was a kid that there's a few of his novels that I'd just love to see brought to life in some way, like Ubik would be a fun one. I know something they did make. There was a French game of Ubik, I think, but I think it was like an RTS. It was like it was not the take I would have had on the material.
The job that you would never have wanted to do in real life that you loved doing in a video game?
This isn't one job, but like any job that involves killing other people. I don't think I would be good at in real life. In fact, whenever I play an FPS, especially online, and I'm shot within like 30 seconds, I'm like, if there was ever a war and I had to do, I'd be dead. Like, I'm always getting sniped. I'm always, oh, damn it. So those games, and there are definitely, obviously I make interesting narrative games, so I'm not the gun game guy, but I do enjoy all video games. And, definitely I've enjoyed a lot of times games which involve running around and shooting or stabbing people. And I enjoy that in the confines of the video game. I probably would be terrible at being a soldier or edit.
Your favorite gaming addiction, the game that you love to play over and over again, if you have one.
If I look at hours spent and a game that I think it was like a game I'll never stop playing, probably Shiren the Wanderer, which I think is a masterpiece. There's a couple of them. The one on the DS was probably my favorite, but this is the greatest roguelike, the greatest rogue game of all time. I think Shiren the Wanderer's systems are so endlessly deep and fun that I have put in hundreds of hours playing those games and can go back and enjoy them and still discover intricacies. The randomness of them kind of keeps things interesting. They're just so rich. So that's definitely my forever game. But also conversely, probably Space Harrier. Love Space Harrier, and just the sheer pleasure of playing Space Harrier and the music and the visuals. Like if I have a headache, and I'm just lots of stuff's happening, and I'll just boot up Space Harrier for 10 minutes, and
Okay.
that makes me feel cool.
What would you rather find in a chest?
This is totally skewed by having played Elden Ring recently, because I'm thinking like a teleport trap. Like, those things, they're scary, but they're extremely useful in that game, and they always take you to places that are super interesting. Opening a chest in Elden Ring and just finding a sword that I'm never going to use started to get old fast, but opening it and being teleported to some bizarre, weird dungeon somewhere was cool. So yeah, I'll take a teleport trap.
And the last one, what is life like after the game over?
Like, is this what is the experience of a player character upon being murdered in a video game? Or is this a more existential question?
In fact, I don't know either.
I know you guys are French, so I was like, this is probably quite deep.
I let you decide which way you prefer to interpret this question.
Yeah, I feel like, because in developing games, you're always seeing behind the scenes, and so you're living with games when you trigger the player death and things don't necessarily stop and they just keep running, and usually it's an infinity of like just lying on the floor glitching out or just staring into nothingness. I always liked in like the Doom games and Quake, and you'd always die, but your head camera would drop to the floor, and then the enemies would just be like and just stood over you, and you could sit forever watching that, and it always seemed quite poetic that things continued, but in a very empty, aimless way. So yeah, I think life after a video game over, I think, is a pretty empty existence.
It's a perfect answer. Thank you very much for your time, for your long time.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have fun. Thanks again, guys.